First of all, welcome to this recording. The recording is one of a series of recordings that provide guidance on the assessments for the 4 core units of this qualification. This particular qualification being the CIPD Foundation Certificate in People Practice. Next slide, please. So this particular recording focuses on the assessment for Unit 3CO03, the core behaviours for people professionals. It's worth noting that the learner assessment briefs are revised on a regular basis, and this particular brief is based on the June 2023 version. You'll see in the code that there is the end of the code, so 3CO03-2301. That indicates that this is the first assessment brief for this unit in 2023. Previous ones will end something like 2201, 2202, etc. It's also worth noting that the last moderation window for this assessment will be September 2024. Next slide, please. So before we begin, let's just take a moment to position this unit. It's different from most of the other units, or all of the other units really, in that whereas the others tend to be about an organisation or a system or a process, this particular unit and this assessment is very much about you. It's about your behaviour, your practice, how ethical and professionally you behave, your approach to professional development. And it requires you to very much look inwards and think about yourself and talk about yourself. So if that comes naturally to you, that's great. But if it doesn't, you need to take that approach for this unit. It's very much about you. Next slide, please. Before any assessment, it's always a good idea to get an overview of the full requirement. What do you have to do in total? Well, in this assessment, there are 2 mandatory assessment tasks. Mandatory, both have to be completed, and they're very simply referred to as Task 1 and Task 2. Each of the tasks has an approximate word count. So in this case, Task 1 has 1,250 words and Task 2 has 750, giving you an approximate total of 2,000 words. It's not a huge amount, but it has been deemed sufficient to answer this assessment in full. So you just need to think about how you distribute those words within each task. So 2 tasks we have to tackle for this assessment. Next slide, please. So let's have a look at Task 1. And Task 1 is an ethical review. So a little bit of context first. The assessment explains how it is our responsibility as professionals to regularly review and develop our performance at work, and that's not just about functional and work skills, but about our behaviours, how we interact with others, how we behave as professionals. So you're asked to answer 4 review questions. So the review questions will structure your review of your behaviours. And the questions come from the perspective of ethics, inclusivity, and human interaction. So to complete the task, you must respond to 4 questions, all 4. And your responses should reflect your understanding of inclusive practice, give a mix of explanation and examples, but you are very much guided by the question there. They will ask for what needs to be given. So let's move on. Next slide, please. Just a quick note here about how to respond to the questions. There's really no point in doing a fabulous explanation and a fabulous response if it's not clear how your responses actually link to the question. So I would suggest, in fact, I'd strongly recommend that you use subheadings throughout your work. Give a subheading to each response you do. And the most sensible way to do that is to use the questions. So in this first example here, we've used the whole question. So it's quite a long question. So if that's going to interfere with your word count, or if it's too word county, too wordy, you may want to just use a redacted version of the question, as in the second example there. So we've just used ethical principle and professional values, so it's obvious what you're responding to. And it's really important that you use the assessment criteria. So you'll see in brackets there's a reference, AC 1.1, etc. And that makes it clear to your tutor and assessor exactly what you're responding to, and that's really important. So, next slide, please. So the question here is, explain one ethical principle and one professional value that you consider to be important and which underpin your behaviour at work. For each of these, you need to provide a real example of how they inform your approach to work. So just a little bit of a note here, first of all. Don't get too hung up on trying to separate ethical principles and professional values. They are essentially the same thing. Ethical principles are more abstract in many ways. They come from ethical theory and thinking, and they're quite purist. But professional values are derived from ethical principles. Like most values, they come from ethical principles, and therefore there will be lots of duplication and overlap. So really don't be too concerned if you're using similar examples. The important thing is that you have two different examples in this question, one that you consider to be an ethical principle and one that you consider to be a professional value. Next slide, please. And I would suggest that the best way to approach this question is to take them one by one. So let's take an ethical principle first of all. So think about the ethical principles that inform your behaviour. There's lots of information around about ethical principles. So select one and explain that principle. You may want to refer to theory, a little bit about ethical theory, but at this level, you're not expected to go into any depth really with theory, but you might to explain the origins of that ethical principle and then explain how it informs the way you work. So if honesty is a strong ethical principle for you, how does that inform the way you work? And then next slide, please. You need to do the same for professional values. So think about, what are your professional values? What informs how you work? What do you apply most at work? What's important to you in the way you do your work? It could be about honouring commitments, being on time, doing what you say you'll do. It might be about working to the very best of your ability, doing a good job. Perhaps it's about maintaining competence, linking to the profession map for passion for learning. It might just be about meeting standards, being professional, meeting professional standards. It may be important to you to be inclusive, to support your colleagues, to be a good team member. It may be integrity that drives you, doing what's right, speaking up when things aren't right. These are just examples. The important thing is that you select your own, that you pick something that honestly does drive you at work, and you talk about it. And here's an example from someone who's a team leader and a trainer. And their example is about being inclusive. So here they're saying that they often work with groups and they find that in those groups, the extroverts naturally dominate, which can be okay, but it does mean that sometimes the views of the more introverted people in the group aren't getting heard. So this particular student has written about how they have taken steps to involve everyone in those discussions, how they maybe ask questions, they target questions at the quieter members, or they've introduced this round robin scenario where everyone takes a turn to have a say on something. So they're really living their value there. They're making sure that in their work they are being inclusive because that's important to them. So that's just an example to inspire your example, but think about your own. So you've talked about your ethical value and your professional value. You've explained them both and you've given an example of each. So we can now move on to question 2. Next slide, please. So this question is fairly straightforward. We're now talking about legislation, and we're looking for 2 ways in which you, as a people professional, conform with ethics-related legislation. If you're not yet working in people practice, you can think about how you would, or it may be that there's aspects of people practice in what you're doing anyway, so you can link to that. These are just examples. I've picked here the Equality Act and the Data Protection Act as ethics-related legislation, but it's very unlikely that any legislation wouldn't be ethics-related. Legislation is really there to help us apply ethics within society. So choose your legislation and come up with 2 ways, 2 examples in how you would conform with that legislation. So for example, I've mentioned the Equality Act, which would possibly relate very much to recruitment. So if you're involved in recruitment or would be involved in recruitment, you can talk about how you use code of conducts and legislation to inform how you recruit people into the organisation. It may be that your work involves data, so equally you could talk about the Data Protection Act. Well, there's many, many more. There must be all kinds of legislation that relates to your role. So think of something that's very personal to you, that you live and you can talk about. Next slide, please. So that's question 2 complete, and we're now seeing question 3. Now, question 3 is quite a big question. It involves 3 contexts, A, B, and C. And you may remember that when we started this presentation, mentioned word count and how you had, I think, 1250 for this task, but that you might not want to distribute them evenly across the 4 questions. And this may be one of the questions that you want to spend a little bit more words on. So it might be that you need to cut some of the others a bit shorter to give you the word availability for this one. Think about that. So there's 3 contexts. We're going to look at context A first of all, which is about contributing views and opinions. And we want an example of how you've behaved how you've done that in a way that's inclusive and respectful. And then we want to know how you could enhance that behavior. So first of all, again, reflect, think inwardly, think about an example, a time when you've contributed your views and opinions. So here, for example, we've used that it could have been a weekly team meeting and thought about, well, how was I inclusive in that team meeting? Maybe I listened to people, maybe I asked questions to ensure I understood them. Perhaps I was very careful to acknowledge others' views and points, not to ignore what other people were saying or to just take their point and reuse it, but to acknowledge other people's contributions. Maybe I stayed calm and friendly throughout. Maybe if I disagreed with something, I didn't react. I was calm and friendly, and I disagreed in a respectful way. So think about your example. Think about how you're inclusive and respectful. And then add on to that another paragraph about, okay, you've talked about what you did well, but how could you improve that? How could you go one step further? How could you develop even more in this area? So again, there's some examples there, but this is about you. Think about how you could enhance your ability to contribute views and opinions while still being inclusive and respectful. So quite a nice, interesting one to think about. And then next slide, please. We can do the same with clarifying problems and issues. So again, reflect back on your work or your student time, and think about when you've had to clarify a problem, when something went wrong. What was the problem, the disagreement, something that didn't go as it should? Come up with your example and then consider, what did you do well there? How did you handle it in a way that was inclusive and respectful? Again, maybe it was about not being reactive. Maybe it was about taking time to find out. Maybe it was about being very evidence-based, looking for the evidence, linking to the professional map. And then the second part of the question, how could you enhance it? What can you do to develop yourself in that area? Not just as a people professional, but as a human being. How can you develop your ability to clarify problems or issues throughout your life? And then we do the same again. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. We're now going to repeat that process, but this time it's as a team member, working effectively as part of a team. So again, think of an example, think of a team you're in. It may be your current team, it may be a different team, it may be your study team. But within that team, how have you behaved in a way that was respectful and inclusive? Think of your examples, write a paragraph on that. Did you take time to get to know people? Did you take part in social activities to help bond the team? Did you help out others beyond your role? Were you supportive? So how were you inclusive and respectful? So a lot of review, reflection and thinking back. And then also thinking, okay, I did that well. There might have been something I didn't do as well as I could. So how can I enhance my behaviour? So for each of these parts, A, B and C, we've got the example, we've got how are you inclusive and respectful, and then we've got some forward thinking about, okay, how can I develop and enhance in that area? So when you've completed A, B and C, that's the end of question 3. And so we can move on to question 4. Next slide, please. Question 4, fairly straightforward. So here you're being asked to think about why a people practice professional needs to stay up to date. There's also a second part to the question in which it asks you to recommend 2 methods you've found effective, you personally have found effective for staying up to date. So first part of the question, why should a people practice professional stay up to date? Well, there are so many reasons for that. They could be around health and safety, compliance, career development, competence. Think for yourself. Think about your own context or anyone else you know in people practice. Think about what could go wrong if they weren't up to date. Why is it important? There has been so much in the news about people not being up to date with compliance or health and safety. There's personal effects of not being up to date, not being compliance with professional requirements, or having just been up to date in terms of how we practice these days and how that could impact on your career. So think for yourself why you think it's important to stay up to date. And then moving on to the second part of the question, next slide, please. You need to recommend 2 ways that you have found effective for staying up to date. So if, like me, you're into podcasts, maybe that's what you do. Maybe it's going on courses, maybe it's magazines and journals, maybe it's books, maybe it's other people, maybe it's team meetings. What do you consider to be your best ways of staying up to date? What would you recommend? And be specific here. If you're saying this podcast is great, this podcast really keeps me up to date, what podcast is it? You're making a recommendation to other people about 2 ways you've found effective. So this is your chance to recommend to others 2 good methods for staying up to date. And once you've completed that question, if we move on to the next slide, please. You've actually completed task 1. So you should by now have a written response which responds to all 4 questions, and it should be very clearly laid out so that it's very clear to your assessor and your tutor which question you're responding to where, which AC reference that relates to, and that it's very readable and understandable. You should also make sure that you're within the approximate 1250 words. Most centres will have a plus or minus 10%, but make sure you are within your 1250 word count and the plus or minus 10%, because non-compliance with that can end up in a refer, no matter how good your response is. So word count's important there. But you've now completed task 1 at this point. So brilliant. Let's move on to task 2. So next slide, please. So task 2 continues the theme, and we're now talking about your approach to professional development. How do you develop yourself? Do you develop yourself? And if so, how are you doing that? Not just about what you do, but most importantly, what's had an impact on you and how has it impacted you? So to complete this task, you have to provide a record of how you have maintained and upgraded your knowledge and skills over the last 12 months and how these have impacted on your performance. You have to present your response to this in one of 2 ways. You can either present an edited version of a CPD record, or you can use the CIPD My Reflections tool, and I'll come back to those two later. But let's just move to the next slide, please, and consider what these activities might be. So we're looking for 3 activities that you've undertaken within the last 12 months. If it's 13 months, no one's going to quibble too much with that, but we're looking at around 12 months, and choose wisely, because you're now going to have to talk about the impact of these activities. So pick 3 activities, hopefully there's more than 3, but pick 3 activities that you can then give you something to talk about in terms of their impact. Your activities can be anything. There's some guidance in the orange box there, that they can be formal planned activities such as an event, or it might be a course or a workshop or an online course, whatever. They can be informal and planned activities. It might be some just researching online you did. You might have just gone down some rabbit hole but found something really fascinating and important to you. Or it might have been about reading a book. It might be a work-based activity. Maybe you undertook a project, or you just took on a task or responsibility that really stretched you. And your activities might have been in response to a performance issue or a weakness, but they don't have to be. It could just be something that inspired you, that you're interested in. So think about the 3 activities you're going to include, and we're only interested in 3. And then next slide, please. For each of those activities, we want you to reflect on how that activity actually impacted on your performance. So again, reflect, think about, how did that impact me? There's some questions to consider in the green box. So did you gain a greater understanding of something? Did you get more knowledge? And if you did, so what? What have you done with that knowledge or understanding? Has it impacted on your behaviour in any way? Is your performance different because of the learning you undertook? Was the activity actually worth doing? Did you get a lot from it? Was it worth the time, cost and effort in terms of the impact it's had on you? Maybe it made you aware of other needs you needed to have. Maybe you read something, or you saw something, or you heard something that just gave you a light bulb moment, and maybe it didn't result in an achievement, but it's changed your thinking. Maybe it's made you more tolerant or more assertive, and that will underpin, maybe in not a very obvious way, but in a subtle way, that's going to underpin everything you do afterwards. If you become more confident or more assertive as a result of that activity, maybe it will impact everything you do going forwards, but that might not be very visible. So consider your conclusions, consider the impact, think about how you've developed. Has your CPD been worth doing? Has it had some kind of impact on you? And reflect on that and give us the information on that for 3 activities. Next slide, please. Just going back to what we said earlier, we ask you to present your CPD reflection in one of 2 ways. So you can either go with a formal structured CPD record, which typically will be a table. You've probably all seen the traditional CPD record, which tends to be in columns about what you did and maybe why you did it and the impact, and in rows for each activity. It doesn't have to be that structure. It's up to you how you present your CPD record. But the important thing here is that we only need to know about those 3 activities. Don't waste word count on presenting a CPD record that has several entries and several columns. Edit it down. If you like, just take it to 2 columns, what you did and what the impact was, and just 3 rows, because we just want those 3 activities. Otherwise, you're wasting your word count. And what we really want is depth here, not breadth. We want to know what the impact was, not loads of words on what you did, but use your words wisely on what the impact was. The other option for presenting your reflections, your CPD record, is to use the My CPD Reflections tool. So if any of you are using the CIPD Learning Hub, you'll be familiar with the CPD Reflections tool. And there are pages in there where you actually taken through a series of questions which structure your reflection. You don't have to answer them all, but you use it as you wish, and then you can insert or attach those pages into your assignment. Just a little bit of help there. If you are using my CPD Reflections tool, I would strongly recommend that you enter that tool using Microsoft Edge as your browser, and then that will give you the facility to use web capture. And if you use web capture, which is just in the right-click menu, you can actually copy your reflections page and then embed it into your assignment. Equally, you can save your reflections pages as PDFs and cut and paste into your assignment in the same way. Don't get too hung up on all of that. It's quite likely that your centre will have worked out the best way to use the reflections tool within an assignment, so take guidance from your centre. The important thing to note, again, is that word count. You've only 750 words, so whichever method you're using, use them wisely. Use them to say what you did and what the impact was, so that you are fully answering the question. Next slide, please. So when you've got to this stage, your assignment is complete, or is it? Have you done a few essential things? So have you added your name and student number? Crucial that we know who you are. Have you proofread your assignment? Again, however satisfying it is to finish it, it's really important that you go back and proofread. If there's lots of waffly bits in there, you might want to edit it down and make sure that the words have been used to produce rich content. You've used your words wisely. Check that there's a clear layout. Is it very obvious which question you're answering and which assessment criteria you're referring to? Check word count. Are you within the word count guidance, plus or minus 10% if that's your centre policy? And most of all, submit on time. You will have a submission deadline, and so make sure you meet the submission deadline. These few areas here can make the difference between a refer and a very, very good pass. So just think about how you finish off that assignment. And just when you finish, just go back and check those things and make sure you've given it your very best effort. So next slide, please. At that point, you've finished the assignment and we've finished the webinar. So we do hope it's been helpful. Thank you for listening. It's probably worth noting here, if you don't know already, that there are other recorded webinars available for the other units, which we also hope you'll find useful. Thank you.